Now, you also often hear the argument from those who want to restrict magazine size that there have been studies that indicate the rise as the use of larger capacity magazines correlates with more deadly shootings. And they often will point to as well a study that indicates the assault weapons ban of the 1994 through 2000, the federal ban, coincided with reduced number of mass shootings overall in the United States. Do you find any validity in these arguments, or what's your response to them?
Well, I mean, first of all, if you want to talk about studies on the actual assault weapons ban, the government-funded official study looking at that ban from 1994 to when the sunset clause came into effect in, I think, 2004. The actual official study looked at that and said, yeah, there is no legitimate way of arguing that this drop in violence had anything to do with the assault weapons ban. And that makes sense, right? Like, this drop in violence that we saw in the 1990s happened across the globe in almost every developed country. And when you actually look at what that official study said, there's no way to attribute that to this policy, and that if we literally at one point, if we were to put it back into effect, it would be a very minimal effect, if any, because they're rarely used in crimes, assault weapons specifically, but even with these, again, quote unquote, large capacity magazines, it just is not, it's not the thing driving violence. And again, so you see this in the Ninth Circuit opinion where they bring this up and they reference several studies, and it's interesting to me how they word it. That what they'll say is, well, in the majority of these cases of mass shootings, mass shooters use these types of magazines. That's like saying in most car crashes, you're using a 4-door sedan. Well, yeah, because it's the most common thing out there. They're buying the gun and using the magazine that came with the gun. The question is whether that magazine, as opposed to just having multiple 10-round magazines, made a difference overall in the deadly effect of those shootings. And again, as someone who studies this for a living, it's just not the case. The reality of mass shootings is this. First of all, mass shootings themselves account for a fraction of a percent of all gun violence. We're talking about a very, very small part of the overall problem. Most gun deaths are suicides. When you're talking about suicide, magazine capacity is irrelevant. Unless you're limiting it down to one bullet, in which case, that's still going to be largely irrelevant. So you're limiting it to this small percentage of the problem, and then you're not understanding the reality of how mass shootings work in practice. So I think there's three things to keep in mind when you're talking about mass shootings, right? So first, you're dealing with an individual who is usually averaging about 5 to 8 minutes of just essentially free time. Again, this is sort of grotesque to think about, but 5 to 8 minutes before they're confronted by someone who is going to forcibly make them stop. That's a whole lot of time that they're working with when we're talking about 3 to 4 seconds to change magazines. So second, and there have been studies on this, they're not typically firing at rates where magazine capacity matters. So a lot of times they're moving from room to room, they're unconfronted by people, they're in a situation where they're not already firing during those several seconds, where they're moving from one target to the next, and it's time in which they can interchange those magazines, and it's not really affecting the overall state of the violence. And then third, and I think this gets lost a lot in this, is these are individuals who overwhelmingly bring multiple guns to the situation. They have multiple guns with multiple loaded magazines and far more ammunition than they're ever likely to use. When you look at, for example, there's a really famous study that looked at the Virginia Tech shooting. So it's the official sort of investigation into Virginia Tech, which, if you recall, the deadliest school shooting in U.S. history. I think 30 plus individuals lost their lives. That shooter used 2 handguns. And the study looked at this and said, specifically this question of, did magazine capacity matter? They looked at this and said, no. This is an individual. He had multiple guns in a scenario with so many extra loaded magazines. Nothing was going to affect. He just is not firing fast enough. It's not a scenario where he is being actively confronted, in that 2 or 3 seconds, where someone is going to stop him in most of those scenarios. And it just does not make, even where it would make a difference, right? We're talking about a minuscule difference of the smallest part of gun violence. And it's hard for me from a policy perspective, seeing this put into, well, this is the reason we're ignoring a fundamental right, is this off chance, this very small chance that in this small percentage of gun violence, it might possibly make a difference. That's not how good policy works. It's certainly not how good constitutional law works. And so it's frustrating.
I think those are all very salient points on this. I've always thought there is more support for the idea that larger capacity magazines may have some impact on the shooting, but it always seemed to me that the issue was, what do you define as a large capacity magazine? If you're just defining everything as a large capacity magazine, which is kind of what you're doing with 10 or more rounds, or anything over 10 rounds is high capacity. Like, that's kind of almost everything. So that seems like a definitional problem there. And then there are situations, you have seen situations in mass shootings, like with Gabby Giffords, where someone reloading during the attack made them vulnerable to other people intervening. But I think, like, as you said, you're talking about like a 1 in a million chance. And the idea is that we should restrict everyone's, this would be, for magazines that hold more than 10 rounds, there's probably billions. I get, like, if you think about it, there's 400 million guns, at least in the country. Most of them are capable of accepting magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. It comes standard with magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. And most of them have multiple magazines. So you're multiplying the number of guns by however many magazines you think is an average, and you're getting a huge number. On the off chance that maybe that forces someone to stop to reload, and then someone else can intervene in that like couple of seconds. Right. It's a pretty far-fetched idea generally as policy.
You have the flip side too, right? Which is, to whatever extent it is interfering with a potential mass shooter's ability to, kill a couple extra people in that couple of minutes. You then also have to look at this from the flip side of, well, what about what's at stake for a law-abiding civilian? Because I also study defensive gun use, as I'm sure you're aware, with the defensive gun use database that Heritage has. Now, first of all, there's not a lot of good data on this flip side in terms of number of rounds fired in civilian encounters, because it's just not reported a lot. Like, it's not easily accessible public information. But I think it's reasonable to assume, like, we know that in most defensive gun use encounters, that the gun isn't even being fired, much less 10 times. So I think it's fair to say it's statistically pretty rare that more than 10 rounds is needed. But when it's necessary, oh God, is it necessary? It tends to be in these cases where that civilian, that law-abiding individual with his gun is outnumbered. He's outgunned, and he is under immediate threat throughout the duration of this time when he would have to take those couple of seconds to reload, which is a very different context, from a mass shooter who has, all the time in the world to and isn't firing and isn't under this sort of confrontational approach from law enforcement, or from, an active threat to his shooting. And then you even have to look at, well, what about the threat of being able to use 30 rounds of force as a deterrent? Like during riots, we saw this. We saw this in Kenosha. We saw this in Ferguson. We saw this. You think about like the rooftop Koreans of the LA riots. This threat of, well, I can take on this crowd if necessary is also a pretty decent deterrent. So it's not just this vacuum of, well, does this really even matter in a gun violence prevention standpoint? And it's not even just, does that matter for purposes of constitutional law? It's also then this counterbalance of, look, it's not just that it's equally important on the other side for the law-abiding civilian. I'd argue it's in a context where it's more important that in those rare scenarios where that amount of, more than 10 rounds is needed, it's really important, which again is why we make exceptions for law enforcement in all of these states, because when it's needed, it is really needed.